I want to briefly talk about television and how television might be actually a very relevant space in terms of how we think about narratives and narrative structures. So, one of the things that we tend to sort of think about when we think about television is this concept of when we watch it, like, oh, there's so much exposition. There's so much exposition in anime. Why doesn't it do more like show, don't tell? Why doesn't it do this other stuff? Why doesn't it do this other? Why does it do this stuff? Why does it do this other stuff? And so on and so forth. There's, all these criticisms levied against television. And we can see a lot of that in anime. And I think it's important when we talk about television in the context of television in anime as a sort of space that condenses and contracts and shapes how we think of narratives. Or at the very least, what narratives are. But whether we think of them or whether we read them in the ways in which television sets up its narrative language is a little bit different. And so what do I mean by that? So I know some of you are probably going to be thinking, oh no, Joe's taking this very sort of media deterministic perspective. Oh no, he's become a media determinist. I'm not trying to do that. I'm not trying to say that there's some particular innateness of the media determinist position, but I do think that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, especially when it comes to talking about anime and when we talk about anime in the context of language. Because there are three key things here I think that are important in the context of discussing televisual language. The first one is, language itself. The second one is television. And the third one is how to adapt television. So let's start off with television. I know it's the second point I made, but it goes a little bit more smoothly into the other ones this way. So television is, if we're going to borrow from McLuhan, it's sort of like a cold media in the context that it exists in this space, and around in this space, it sort of gives information. But whether it actually gives information clearly is another thing, because in this space, television doesn't necessarily command people, but rather what it does is it exists in an infrastructure where it has to expect that on some level it might actually be competing for the viewer's information with a lot of other things. Like you might be watching television, say, while you're doing work, or you might watch television while you are cooking, or while you're eating, while you're cleaning up, while you're playing video games. You might be doing all these other things, and in the background you have television. This is actually very important, because now what this means that if you're a writer, or if you're a screenplay writer, or you're a storyboarder, or you're a director, or perhaps if you're even a production committee, you have to consider that if you're going to broadcast something, you're essentially broadcasting it on a device where not everybody is going to pay attention. And so what ends up happening is, as a result, it might make a lot of sense actually to have some exposition. It might make a lot of sense to not necessarily show and, instead of show, don't tell, you kind of just tell them. It might make a lot of sense to have these sorts of audio or visual redundancies that, aside from production, I'm not discarding production, I'm not discarding the economies of production, I'm not discarding politics or culture and all that kind of stuff. Those are very important. But it makes a lot of sense that a lot of these things that we look at and say, well, this is kind of weird, or this is kind of redundant, or this is kind of useless, or this is kind of needless, a lot of them sort of have their space in television. And you can see how a lot of these moments, we don't notice it. Or, why don't we notice it, or why don't we talk about this, why don't we talk about this in, say, American shows? Why don't we talk about it in, let's take a look at, say, The Office, for example. Do we see the same problems or the same things that people complain about in anime storytelling that we would see in, say, The Office? And I would argue we do, but we don't talk about it. And so why don't we talk about it? And I think that sort of boils down to language. And this is not a sort of semiological thing, but, language as in the people or a lot of people who are talking about narratives in anime might not necessarily, or the people who chide it, might not necessarily be that familiar with the language. And so what I mean by that is people who are saying like, this is so much exposition in here and so on and so forth. And it's like, well, absolutely. And the reason why is because when you sit down and you watch anime, and it's in Japanese, we're assuming a subtitled audience here, but we're watching anime and it's in Japanese and it's got subtitles on and so on and so forth, and you don't understand the language. Well, then what ends up happening there is you don't have the luxury of treating this televisual media as television. You can't really go off and do something else without compromising your understanding of what's going on. You're constantly paying attention to it, whether you're watching it on your computer or your laptop or your phone or your tablet, whatever. You are essentially taking a televisual piece of media and you're treating it like cinema. And cinema is really important in this context because when we talk about cinema, what is the infrastructure of the cinematic language? Well, you go into a theater, you go into a cinema, and then you sit down, and then it is essentially offloading all of this information on you. You have no way of sort of walking away from cinema, not in like a literal sense, and like, oh yeah, I can go to the bathroom while I'm watching a movie. Oh, you're wrong, Joe. But I mean, like, you have no way in terms of breaking yourself away from the cinema, and then in terms of what it presents to you, and still getting the idea. The more extreme example would probably be something like a newspaper. You can't really take your eyes away from reading and so on and so forth and still be considered reading. But I think cinema is closer here. This idea that it offloads information, it has your control, and it knows it has your control. And so that's why we might feel like anime movies are a little bit more subtle in a lot of moments. They can feel a lot different because they know they have that control over people, that people are going to be paying attention. But does TV have that luxury? Does TV know it has that luxury? Because I'd argue it knows it doesn't have that luxury. And I'd argue it knows it doesn't have that luxury, and therefore people, but the moment we treat it like cinema, I think we shouldn't treat it innately like cinema, but rather we should be aware of where it is like television, and yet we have to treat it like cinema. So what I mean by that is, you can still watch something and say, it's poorly written here for this, this, and this, but I think we shouldn't simply say, well, why can't it be more subtle here? Why can't it do a show, not tell thing here? Well, it's because that it's aware that you might not be the exact audience it might be aiming for. You, as the cinematic person forced into a cinema evaluative mode, because it's television. And so an example I want to use, and I think that really outlines it for me, is, so on my 3x3, one of the shows that I have on is a show called Fomun wo Sagashite. And it's a story about a girl who, and so on my 3x3, I have this, so on my sorry, I'm blanking out now. But so on my 3x3, I have this show called Fomun Sagashite. And it is broadcast from 2002 to 2003. It runs about 52 episodes, 52 to 56. And so in that sense, it runs just a little bit over 1 year. So what's the story of Fomun Sagashite? It's a story about a little girl who's dying of throat cancer, where she has 1 year left to live. And what happens is she meets two Shinigami, and they grant her one wish, and she wants to be able to become a famous singer so she can go off and find this boy that she's in love with. So it's a story about a girl who's got 1 year left to live, and it's broadcast over the span of 1 year. And you can tell that it's very clearly aware of its televisual language, or very clearly aware of its television influence, or the influence that the TV set plays upon it as a storytelling device. Because not only is it appreciably different from the manga in a lot of different ways, but at the beginning of almost every episode, you have this PSA for children, which is a common thing, where it says, please don't sit so close to the television. Please don't sit so close to the TV screen. Even after it has been ripped onto the CDs and DVDs, it's not CDs, but onto the DVDs, that PSA is still there. And so what that ends up sort of signaling is that because it knows it's for television, it creates a story and it's broadcasted through a story that is appropriate for television. And so what you have is these episodes where it feels like almost nothing happens, or episodes that feel like recap episodes, or episodes that feel like they're incredibly expository or not very subtle, and so on and so forth. Well, it's because it's very much aware of exactly who it's aimed for and what media in which it's presenting its story. And it's very clearly aware that this larger macro story is very appropriate for how it's broadcast. But you can't put that in a film. You can't capture that exact sentimentality or the exact moment in the film. There is no clear Full Moon wo Sagashite film that can really sort of capture that sentiment. And so that's why I think it's an absolutely interesting and perhaps in some ways a fairly brilliant piece on time. This piece in which it looks at a sort of conception of time through the broadcast. And so that's what I sort of wanted to talk about, this idea that we shouldn't really, just like how we shouldn't throw media determinism, the baby out with the bathwater in terms of the media determinism position, but also this idea that we shouldn't, or at least we should be a little bit more critical about our own tastes when we say that this thing here isn't very subtle. Why isn't it like this? Or why is it doing all this exposition and so on and so forth? Well, let's talk about, how was it broadcast? Why was it broadcast there? And perhaps, is it aware of its own limitations as something that can transmit something? And the wild card in this whole thing is obviously going to be Netflix. Now, I haven't seen a lot of Netflix's anime originals, but they're very clearly trying to set up this sort of binge sort of culture with their work. And I think that's actually a very important space to sort of rethink this relationship between cinematic evaluation of television. The anime fan who treats television like cinema because they have to pay attention to the subtitles. This middle ground is very interesting. And I really hope that somebody does, on some level or in some place, take a look at that. Because that might be a very interesting bridge, or it might be a completely new language in itself. I don't know. This is purely speculative. But yeah, that's pretty much all I've got. And I hope you guys find it interesting. I don't know.